In front of dozens of stunned passengers, a TSA officer ripped Amara Jordan's dress under the guise of a joke, leaving her humiliated and exposed. What he didn't know was that her husband owned the entire airport. The laughter of his colleagues, the indifference of the crowd, and the complicity of a broken system should have silenced her. But Amara wasn't someone who crumbled under injustice. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the beginning. Amara Jordan, a 32-year-old corporate attorney, approached the TSA checkpoint at Wilmington International Airport, her heels clicking rhythmically on the polished tile floor. She was dressed in a pristine, cream-colored sheath dress that hugged her figure tastefully, exuding an air of professionalism and elegance. Her short, natural curls framed her sharp features, and her caramel-toned skin glowed under the harsh airport lighting. Amara was accustomed to holding her head high in predominantly white spaces, navigating microaggressions and subtle prejudice with practiced grace. But on this particular morning, she was running late, her mind occupied with thoughts of her upcoming meeting and the time she'd lost waiting in the long security line. As she placed her belongings on the conveyor belt and stepped into the body scanner, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The TSA officer monitoring her, Mike Henson, gave her an exaggerated once-over. His smirk made Amara's stomach tighten with unease. Henson, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a paunch stretching his ill-fitting uniform, was notorious among his colleagues for his inappropriate jokes and unprofessional demeanor. Still, Amara assumed her passing through security would be routine, until it wasn't. "She's hiding something under that dress," Henson announced loudly, his smirk widening as he exchanged glances with the other officers. His tone dripped with mockery, and a ripple of stifled laughter spread among his peers. Amara froze, her pulse quickening. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice low but firm. She looked him in the eye, trying to convey the seriousness of her objection. But Henson wasn't done. "Better check thoroughly," he said, stepping toward her. Before Amara could react, he reached out and tugged at the hem of her dress, under the pretense of conducting a search. The ripping sound echoed sharply in the tense silence. The dress tore halfway up the back, exposing the zipper and part of her undergarment. Gasps erupted from passengers nearby, their faces a mix of shock and horror. Some pulled out their phones, documenting the incident. Amara's cheeks burned with humiliation as her hands instinctively moved to cover herself. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, scrutinizing and pitying. "You've got to be kidding me," Amara managed to say, her voice trembling but defiant. Her initial shock was giving way to a simmering anger. She stood as tall as she could, despite the humiliation, her fists clenched at her sides. "I demand to speak to your supervisor, right now." Henson crossed his arms, the smirk never leaving his face. "Calm down, lady. It's just a joke," he said dismissively, as though her outrage was an overreaction to his humor. The other officers behind him exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing, their silence complicit in his behavior. Amara's gaze swept the crowd of onlookers. She could see their faces. Some were recording, others were whispering to each other, but none intervened. It was a stark reminder of how often black women's dignity is deemed expendable, their pain relegated to entertainment or apathy. "I'm not going anywhere until your supervisor gets here," Amara said, her voice rising. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the ripped fabric at her back, holding on to the last shreds of her composure. Inside, a storm of emotions swirled: anger, embarrassment, and a fierce determination not to let this man reduce her to a punchline. The moment marked the beginning of an encounter that would not only change Amara's day, but also spark a chain reaction, exposing a pattern of systemic prejudice. But at that instant, all she felt was the weight of injustice pressing down on her, challenging her to stand tall against it. Amara wasn't just any passenger. Behind her calm and dignified exterior was a network of influence and power that most couldn't fathom. Her husband, Nicholas Jordan, was not only a renowned entrepreneur who owned several high-profile businesses, but also the majority stakeholder in Wilmington International Airport itself. The same airport where Mike Henson had just publicly humiliated her. As soon as Amara reached a private restroom to assess the damage and compose herself, she didn't waste a moment. Clutching her phone with trembling hands, she dialed Nicholas. Her voice cracked as she recounted the incident, each word heavy with humiliation and frustration. Nicholas's voice, typically warm and reassuring, was calm but laced with a dangerous edge. "Stay right there," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll handle this." True to his word, Nicholas arrived in less than 30 minutes, a commanding figure flanked by airport management and his personal legal advisor. His tailored suit and unyielding expression radiated authority, causing heads to turn as he strode through the terminal. By then, the situation had already taken on a life of its own. Several passengers who had witnessed the incident had shared videos on social media. Within minutes, hashtags like #TSA fail, #accountability now, and #justice for Amara began trending. The clips captured the laughter of the TSA officers, Amara's quiet but powerful demand for respect, and the visible anguish on her face as she tried to hold her torn dress together. Witnesses, emboldened by the growing online outrage, came forward to corroborate Amara's account. They were mocking her, one man told a local reporter. It was disgusting. She didn't do anything to deserve that. Another woman described how the TSA agents laughed, while passengers watched in stunned silence. The airport manager, visibly pale and shaken by the unfolding PR nightmare, approached Nicholas nervously. "Mr. Jordan, I assure you we'll launch a full investigation." Nicholas cut him off with a sharp look. "That's not good enough," he said. His voice was low, but carried a weight that silenced everyone nearby. "My wife's dignity was trampled here, and it happened under your watch." He didn't wait for a response. With the airport manager and legal advisor trailing behind him, Nicholas headed straight to the TSA checkpoint. The buzz of tension in the air was palpable. Mike Henson was leaning casually against a counter, his smugness beginning to falter as he noticed the growing attention. When he saw Nicholas approach, his bravado evaporated entirely. "Is there a problem, sir?" Mike asked, his voice uneven as he tried to feign ignorance. Nicholas fixed him with a piercing stare. "You humiliated my wife," he said, his words measured and cold. "You don't know who you just messed with." Mike opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, clearly at a loss. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Nicholas. Nicholas turned to the airport manager. "I want him removed from duty immediately, and every one of you who stood by and laughed while my wife was degraded, you're complicit. That stops now." The manager nodded vigorously. "Of course, Mr. Jordan, we'll take immediate action." But Nicholas wasn't done. "My legal team will be conducting an independent review of every complaint filed against this TSA unit, and I expect full cooperation." As the confrontation unfolded, the tension in the terminal escalated. Passengers whispered among themselves, watching the powerful man demand accountability in real time. Nicholas didn't raise his voice, but the gravity of his presence was enough to make it clear. Justice for Amara wouldn't just be a promise, it was an inevitability. News outlets picked up the story quickly, amplifying public outrage. The TSA released a statement claiming to investigate the incident, but Nicholas wasn't content with promises. Using his influence, he ensured that Mike and his colleagues were immediately suspended, pending inquiry. Amara, though shaken, refused to stay silent. "This isn't just about me," she said during a press conference. "Black women face this kind of dehumanization every day. Today it was me, but tomorrow it could be your sister, your mother, or your daughter." Behind the scenes, Nicholas instructed his lawyers to file a formal complaint, not just against the officer, but against the TSA for systemic negligence. Amara worked with local advocacy groups to shed light on the broader issue of racial profiling and abuse of power in airport security. Months later, the investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct in the TSA unit at Wilmington International Airport. Mike and his cohorts were fired, and several others faced retraining. Amara's lawsuit led to a settlement, which she donated to organizations fighting for racial equity in aviation policies. The airport introduced new diversity and sensitivity training, and Nicholas ensured that the management team was restructured to prioritize accountability. The Jordans turned the incident into an opportunity for systemic change, but not before Mike was publicly called out for his actions. For Amara, the experience was a painful reminder of the prejudices that lingered in everyday spaces. But as she watched the reforms unfold and heard from Black travelers who felt safer because of her actions, she felt a glimmer of hope. "They thought they could strip me of my dignity," Amara said during a community forum. "Instead, we showed them what accountability looks like."